All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Vicki, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on. And on this show, I usually spend a good chunk of the episode talking about people's inspirations that, kind of launch them into their careers. So I know in your book, and anybody who's listening, definitely pick up a copy of Why I Do VFX. But reading your book, it sounds like a love of movies is not the best reason to get into visual effects because you get so busy, you don't have a lot of time to watch movies. But I want to know early on, though, before you knew that, before you came to that realization, what was it that kind of drew you toward that career path?
Well, it kind of started when I was younger at 14. I was given a camcorder. And
Mm,
back then, I was kind of like a quiet, shy kid. I didn't have any friends. I was bullied. And because I was bullied, I didn't have any friends. So I was given a camcorder, and that kind of became an outlet for expression for me because, as a quiet kid, I felt like I didn't have a voice. And in a way, I kind of didn't. So I went around kind of shooting random stuff of nature. And that's how I kind of grew from my passion of capturing those videos, editing it in post, and I discovered, hey, I can create a story from it, and that kind of grew into visual effects. So yes.
yeah. So it started with a video camera, and that's kind of how I started getting interested in all this. My friend's dad collected video cameras. Like when they'd come out, he'd grab like the newest types. He'd grab like a VHS camera, then a mini DV camera, and we would get the last iteration they didn't care about. So he just passed that on to us, and so I totally relate with that. When was the first time someone saw what you were working on and maybe notice like, oh, you might have something, or maybe you should pursue this as something more than just something fun to do?
First, well, wow, that's a good question. First time somebody saw and thought that I should pursue it. Well, I think I don't think anybody gave me that comments of telling me to pursue it. I just continued pursuing it,
Hmm.
regardless of whether anyone saw it or not. Because again, it's like a channel of self-expression for me.
Yeah,
So whether anyone says, "Oh, you're good," or "Oh, you're not good," like I didn't care because I enjoyed it. I
right.
felt like myself doing it, so I continued doing it.
Did you have a certain style or director or type of movie that you felt like you were trying to emulate, or was it totally just totally uniquely you in those early days?
In the early days, I don't think there was anything that directly influenced my style that I could recall. I mean, back then I was kind of a newbie.
Mhm.
So I guess in a way, I was like unsure if this was what I'm supposed to do in the sense of, when I'm creating effects, it wasn't that good as like Hollywood level.
Right.
So I wasn't able to tell whether this is like really good or not personally, right?
Yeah.
So as for style, I mean, again, like I couldn't tell whether it's actually a style or not. So it's kind of in that gray zone area, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, tell me about getting started with visual effects, because it is something like I said, I always stuck with the behind the camera stuff. Like for me, I've opened After Effects. I've done a couple small things, but it's a different world. It's a totally different process. How did you make that transition from shooting to the visual effects side? And because that's an intimidating jump.
Hmm. Well, I don't know. I don't think I felt like there was a transition personally. I just gravitated towards it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I know I started with production side, shooting stuff, but I think for me, when I had the control of kind of putting things together and telling my
Hmm.
story in post production, that's when I really kind of clicked. Where okay, I mean, yes, production is fun. I like to shoot stuff, but is the final product, is the telling of the story that I could, well, that's what I thought that I could only do in post.
Hmm.
That's how it, that's why I went into that. So
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you describe it that way, because like for me, and this goes to the limited knowledge of any kind of visual effects stuff, whenever I have to do it, it's a chore, and I have to think about it a lot before I go into it, and be heavily structured. And I don't think, I know it is, but for me, I never think of it as that's a part of the storytelling process, where it's like I can figure something out or put something together. For me, by the time I'm in it, I'm like, I have to know exactly what I'm going to do already and stick to it, or else I'm going to get lost and start ruining everything. But it's interesting hearing your perspective, going into it and it's almost like another canvas. Like the way that
Right.
people think of picking up a camera and shooting, like you have this opportunity to do something in that realm. Do you remember like your first attempt or project, or like what first made you go like, I need to do something beyond what I'm capturing on the actual, camera? Like I need to add something or do something to this.
I guess the first so-called visual effects project I ever did, there was not, visual effects different from editing, obviously, but like the first visual effects project I did was actually like a kind of a music video cover.
Hmm.
And I think it was just the vision that I had. I wanted to have this girl singing against like a backdrop of like mystical forest, but obviously Singapore is like an urban environment, so it'll be hard to find that kind of forest that I was looking for. So that was my first attempt at visual effects. Now obviously I talk about this in the book too, like it looked really terrible now that if you look at it,
Yeah.
but I kind of enjoyed it. It was really authentic in that sense, and it was very raw, and that was my first attempt using After Effects, trying to kind of rotoscope and put in a bunch of trees and track it in there poorly.
Well, I loved in the book because when you talk about that, you say, you did it and it didn't look that good, but you wouldn't go back and change it
No.
because and I think that's something that I think is really important, because I think a lot of people, especially creatives, and I would definitely put you in that category. Like for creatives, I think sometimes we have a tendency to say like, oh, I wish I could add this and do this. And I'm never done with this shot or this thing. And I think it takes a lot to be able to look back at the early stuff and appreciate it for what it is and build past that instead of constantly going back and trying to tinker with it or keep working on it. Like, did it accomplish what you needed it to at that time? And I think that's something that I think a lot more creatives should develop, is that thick skin to say like, I wasn't perfect, but I did it and I created it.
Yeah.
Look, you've worked on so many incredible projects now, in various capacities. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy, I mean, Walking Dead, like all of these different projects. How did you break in from, the smaller world into these really massive projects that have, huge VFX teams working on them and massive scale budgets? Like, how did you climb into that world?
That's an excellent question. So, I mean, depending on how much time we have, I kind of like either make the story short or long. So in short form, it's like there was an internship program at school in the US, and I went to study visual effects. I applied for it. Long story short, I got in, and that's how I worked on Walking Dead. And basically, it's like once you get your foot in the door, it's very easy to kind of grow from there. So obviously, in order to get in, like you need to have the good, solid portfolio as a base.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's essentially that. That's how I kind of broke in. So yes.
Yeah, it's wild. That's like the first project, because like I mean, especially then, I mean, the show has I think dropped a little bit in how
Yeah.
much people pay attention to it, but still around that time, it was one of the biggest shows going. I mean, people would get together Sunday nights and watch The Walking Dead. So stepping into that world, did it feel intimidating? Did it feel like, or was it just kind of this is a job, I'm going to do my job and hope I can do it the best I can?
Yep, that's basically, you got that down. So the second part, well, I guess, for me, I was actually surprised that number one, that, it's The Walking Dead and I get to work on it. And that's my first ever job. And I haven't even graduated yet.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, I believe when I remember clearly, like the second day on the internship, they gave me some test shots, but the second day itself, they gave me real shots from the show
Hmm.
itself, because they saw that I was so good on the first day. They decided, you know what, let's just use her
Wow.
immediately. We're just gonna give her on the second day, like give her real shots. So yeah. So as for the intimate, well, I didn't feel like, again, it's just a job. So I just see it as objectively, okay, I just need to do this. That's all. No starry eyed. Oh, it's so cool. But yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, it's really interesting listening to people within the industry, because like you sit and talk to people, and I think there is, you know, you'll hear occasionally there's a story where someone's starstruck or they're shocked they're working on a certain project, but at a certain point, like you're still doing the same task. You're just scaling it up bigger or smaller. And it's always, I think it's funny because before I had ever talked to anyone who did it professionally, it was always like, wow, I can't imagine you'd be starstruck every time you walk into it. You see a studio and you go in and sit at your computer. And it really is. I think you kind of have to look at it like that, because if you're coming at it from a fan perspective, it's going to affect you in one way or another. I am curious about that specific angle of it because we talked about the creative side, bringing in that creative energy to it. But when you come into a show 4 seasons in, or you come into a sequel like a Jurassic World, or you come into a Guardians of the Galaxy, there's so much of that world already defined. And you're coming in and you get your corner of it, your piece of it to work on. Is it less creatively fulfilling working within somebody else's sandbox, or is it something where you do have a little bit of freedom to add something that makes it your own?
Well, so I would say like visual effects is a creative craft only in the execution part. So how you solve the problems, how you want to fix the shot, how you want to render stuff. Well, maybe not rendering, but all that, the execution part is the creative aspect of visual effects. But as for the vision, the look, the style, you have no say in that as a visual effects artist. So a good visual effects person is someone that is not trying to control that stylistic aspect, because you're not the director, and you're not even a supervisor, and even then the supervisor doesn't control that. So yeah.
I always wanted that, because that's something where, again, everything is so structured in, and you've got this window that you get to work in. Can you, when you're sitting in there and you're working on a project, and in your book you talk about the idea that loving movies is great, but getting into VFX, it's extremely time consuming. Like, you give a breakdown of your schedule and you're working pretty much all day, working on shots and trying to put these things together. How quickly into that process did you realize, like, oh, I'm not going to have a lot of time to sit and watch my work on the big screen the way that you probably fantasized in the beginning?
Let's see. Well, I think it was like a slow realization that I didn't even know I was realizing. So how that worked is like, okay, so I didn't have any expectations going into visual effects thinking that, oh, it's going to be so cool when I see my name in the credits. Like, that wasn't what I was after. Like, again, it's all about self-expression, but it didn't hit me until, some, I guess, 1 or 2 years in, and also eventually working at startups, realizing in hindsight that, hey, you know what, actually it's just another job. You just go there, you perform your task, you execute, and then that's it. So there's not much glamour to it, other than, okay, sure, sometimes you get to go to events, which is cool, but that's it. Like, so yeah.
I'm curious too, going to the film school side, because you started working before graduating on a massive project, a project people would kill to get any slice of at the time. But in your book, you also talk a lot about, people glamorize the idea of dropping out of film school, or dropping out of school in general and pursuing an entrepreneurial, course. And there's something exciting about that. We look at a Tarantino, or we look at a Christopher Nolan, and we look at these people who Steven Spielberg went outside the system and still became incredible filmmakers. And like you say in your book, though, you never hear the story of the people that dropped out of film school and end up working at Blockbuster, and then Blockbuster shuts down, they go work somewhere else. So what is your take on film school? Do you think it's something that everybody wanting to go into the industry should be a part of? Do you think do you think there is value, and do you think we've probably, to a detriment, really talked down people going to a formal kind of education setting?
Yeah, it used to be the other way around, where education is kind of brought out as this important thing.
Right.
But now, because of all these entrepreneurs, and it's not their fault, it's just that it happened that the pattern is that they did drop out of school. Now with all this, you kind of did the 180 flip. Yeah, exactly. So I was thinking, like, it's not just black and white. There's a gray area. There are people who dropped out who amounted to nothing, frankly, and there are people who went to school and amounted to something as a filmmaker or creative. So I think it's kind of a big mistake to just write off all schools, whether it's film, art, anything, just because some famous person did it. So it really, I believe it really depends on your personal preference and style. Like, what do you think suits your current situation better? Do you like having someone to kind of have that structure for you, or do you like doing things on your own? So yeah.
Was that the benefit that you saw? Was it the structure and just learning step by step the right way to do it? Or was it something where you were looking for something else and that ended up being the takeaway?
Well, for me personally, going to school is a great way to get out of your country. So, I'm in Singapore, and usually what happens is like if you study overseas, it's like a great opportunity not only to expose yourself to different cultures, to make connections. It's a great way. So for me, that's actually the primary thing why I went to school. Obviously, besides Asian parents forcing it upon you or whatever, but I think it depends on your intentions and your what's your agenda. If you want to work in Hollywood and you're in another country, going to school around the area is probably a good first start,
Sure.
even if you don't want to. So yeah, it's like different ways of looking at it, not just about the education itself.
Were there any, on the flip side, were there any negatives that came where you felt like, oh, if I hadn't done film school, then I wouldn't have seen this, or I would have had experiences doing something else sooner? Is there anything you look back and go like, okay, the pros were there, but maybe these were a couple of the cons?
No, not really. So I believe for me, in every decision I make, I think about it very carefully so that I have no regrets, and I do have no regrets. So even if I look at it in hindsight for school, the only possible little tiny regret I have is like living in a dorm with roommates. That's probably the only thing. So there's nothing that I would regret. However, I think if we put in, in the perspective of someone else, maybe they'll think about the student loans and stuff like that. But because that wasn't my experience, there's nothing that I kind of regret.
Yeah. Just coming near the end, I do want to give you a chance to kind of talk about some of the things you're working on right now, because while you are playing a part in a lot of big projects, you have also worked on some incredible things on your own, such as your book, Why I Do VFX, which people can go to the show notes of this episode and pick up a copy. You're also doing a lot of training with virtual students all over the globe. Can you talk a little bit about that and how people can find out more about that?
Yeah, so I teach, I believe, close to 90,000 students right now, over 182 countries, visual effects, virtual reality, and filmmaking. So for that, it's on various platforms, Udemy, stuff like that. And basically, students kind of learn some of the tips, tricks, and insights I've personally learned myself in Hollywood visual effects and put it in there in those courses. So yes.
So they can find that in Udemy. Is there anywhere else that they can check it out, or you have your personal website?
Yes, my personal website. You go to, I believe, shop. There should be other links as well. Skillshare, Teachable, Stack Commerce. Yeah, a bunch of things.
Perfect.
And even
yeah,
in China
I'll link
too.
to
Yeah.
too.
So there you go. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know you mentioned you're training people from all around the world. Being in Singapore, have you seen any of the workings of the film industry there? And, are there any filmmakers or anybody that you'd say, oh, keep an eye on them, or anything that you'd say like, oh, for someone who's unaware of, the cinema there, they should check out these films?
Yeah, I would say like Singapore's film industry is kind of growing. It's still small. It used to be even smaller, but it's growing. There are a few notable Singaporean filmmakers, but only to the local community. They're not like large scale, worldwide notable. I would say Singapore is a little bit trying to emulate China's film industry and Hollywood at the same time. So they're looking up to those two entities right now. So they're trying to form their own identity, but at the same time trying to kind of emulate the Western media and China, or perhaps even Korea. So it's around, but again, it's not like anything I would say is of global impact yet.
Gotcha. Yeah. Very soon, I'm sure it will be, with how many people are getting interested in this, with how many people are learning how to do it, with how accessible it's becoming. It's only a matter of time before we start seeing a ton of voices from all over the place start diving into this. I know we just have a few minutes left. I want to ask you a couple quick questions with some quick answers. It's something of a random round I like to end off with. First of all, if you had the opportunity to either remake a film or get involved with an existing franchise, whatever that is, what would you want to work on? What type of project?
Ooh, remake a film. Sweeney Todd. Well, only because I like the film. I can't think of any other reason. So Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Yeah.
Gotcha. What do you think is the best decade of film history?
Oh man, I don't know. I'm not really good in the history stuff. I would say like, the old film days, just because I'm a fan of the style. That's really about it. The Audrey Hepburn and stuff like
Hmm.
that.
Gotcha. What is the best piece of advice that you would give to an aspiring filmmaker who's listening to this?
Ooh, best piece of advice. Be very persistent at your goals, because there will be obstacles regardless of who you are, where you're from. There will be obstacles along the way, but persistence is key, especially as a creative. Film is a competitive field, so if you want your films to really eventually get seen, I think you just have to keep creating like forever until you die. So be very persistent till death do you part.
There's the title for the episode: Create Until You Die. There you go. And I'm going to ask one last question. I don't ask this usually in the random round, but in your book, you talk a lot, and I think it's really good, especially in light of the Me Too kind of era. And that's something that my other show deals with quite a lot. But I am curious, you talk a lot about how the conduct on some of these work environments in the film industry can be pretty negative, with, both racial remarks, sexual remarks, things like that. What advice would you give to showrunners or directors who are trying to cultivate a healthy environment? As someone who's working in VFX, which isn't always, the most glamorous, you're working in a realm where people don't always pay a lot of thought to the environment they're creating there. What advice would you give to directors that are overseeing large crews and VFX members and things like that?
So I would I would basically tell them to do what I did for my own startup when I had, it's hard to kind of manage remotely, but you have to keep your ears open really wide. So be extremely observant. And if you even get a hint that something may be wrong, clarify it. So for example, if you feel like this person's getting harassed, it's just a sense, don't doubt it. Just at least clarify with that person first. So be very, very observant.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, like I mentioned, my other show, I talk with victims of sexual abuse, actually. And that's one of the things that's happened a lot is people say, if someone just would have asked, hey, what's going on? It would have given me the freedom to talk about it. And I really love that you spent a good portion of the book talking about that issue, because it's something where, it happens in every workplace, but, within the film industry, it's been part of the conversation, but there's not a lot of practical advice on how do we correct this. And I think it's good you spent a lot of time focused on that. So I want to make sure I asked about that before we got to the end. But yeah, as far as the rest of the information, all of your courses, the book, everyone who's listening can head over to the show notes of this episode, grab a copy of the book, post a picture to Instagram, tag Vicki, and
leave a review. We need more reviews. Yeah.
And most importantly, create until you die. That is the takeaway today. But thank you so much for joining me on today's show and taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Film School podcast. If you appreciated the content on the show, don't forget to leave a 5-star review and hit subscribe so you won't miss a single episode.